What's up, YouTube? It's your boy AP, and as we approach the end of week 2 of early access, I figure it's about time to drop you guys a fully updated endgame build guide for my perma-stun Spark Stormweaver character that we've been playing since day 1 of the league. Now, for everybody new to the channel, you might be asking, why should I play your Spark build? Well, let's first start off with Spark as a mechanic. Spark ability covers the whole screen with projectiles that will bounce off of objects and walls, which makes it so you don't really have to aim in order to full clear a map. Also, by the same nature, it's pretty good at clearing quote-unquote bad map layouts, which we do find quite a bit in Path of Exile 2. These would be maps that aren't simply a straight line or a big open square. A lot of maps you're going to have to navigate through corridors, which have lots of nooks and crannies, monsters hiding all over the place. And these spark bolts will just fly into all these little areas and help you clear the map much more easily. As for the build itself, it has over 6,000 energy shield and 5,000 mana, which both work together as one big HP pool. 11,000 total is enough to tank almost anything the game can throw at us, and if this wasn't even enough, we also build around a very strong perma-disabling layer of defense by scaling Electrocute up to a point where we should be 5-second disabling everything in the map near instantaneously. We can also perma-disable bosses by bursting them down in that 5-second window with insane DPS skill combos. Right before we jump to build specifics, I want to put a quick disclaimer for people who haven't been following along since League's start. There are quite a few complex mechanisms interacting between our keystones as well as our gear, and this is fully explained in a previous video. I'll put a thumbnail image on screen so you know what to look for. This is found in the Spark playlist, and I would say this is mandatory viewing because it helps give you context for why we're getting certain passive trees and ignoring others that might seem like they're going to be good. It also helps to give context on why we're getting certain stats as a priority on our gearing. So you could pause this video, give that a quick view, and then come back and we'll go over all the fully updated passive tree, gearing, skill gem choices, etc. We're going to start things off with gearing. For damage, your wand is the most important piece, followed by the focus, followed by the rings. For the wand, you want to make sure it has a decent amount of plus level to all lightning spell skill gems. This can go up to maximum of 5, and if you're curious to how much one extra level will impact your damage, just put the lightning mastery skill gem on your spark. Right now I'm at 35,760, and with one extra level, it goes up to 40,000. That is a massive scaling vector. It would be nice to have one extra level, but right now we're stuck with +4. Other things you want to scale are cast speed, max mana, and either increased spell damage or increased lightning damage. As you can see, I have a really good cast speed roll. Now for cast speed, you do need to be aware, the more you scale cast speed, the more of a mana drain you're going to have on your character. It's the one offensive stat that drastically drains your mana. So if you are having mana issues, you could opt to possibly skip this, but just note this is a very, very good way to scale our damage. So for higher budgets, you're going to want to scale your mana regen and also scale your cast speed so that we can really pump the damage out. Mana is a really good stat because, well, first of all, for every 1,250 mana we have, it is an extra 100% damage as extra lightning damage. And mana is also a defensive tool for our mana, and if you watch the previous video, you'll understand scaling mana also scales our energy shields. So it's a nice double dip stat that scales damage as well as defense. Increased spell damage is just nice to get. We don't get too much of it. It would be probably the 4th most important thing here. And then, always gaining some percentage of damage as extra of any element type is quite nice. So this wand has 5 decent stats, and the gain 2 mana per enemy killed that's obviously a dead stat, that doesn't matter. Now moving on to the focus, I do want to quickly touch on a shield that Captain Lance is using called Moxolotto's Machination. And quick side note, Captain Lance, a buddy of mine, probably the other YouTuber you should be following for Spark if you're not already. We're playing similar builds and he has some nice ideas that will be applicable to this character. So do yourself a favor, give him a follow. And to explain the reasoning he's doing Moxolotto's Machination, that is an incredibly tanky shield that still offers quite a bit of offense. Focuses don't come with built-in block. So by using this unique shield, you're just by default blocking 25% of hits, which is going to be huge when you already have such a massive HP pool. We're just amplifying that by another defensive scaling vector. And for the shield, you want to have a corruption with 3 sockets. So that does get a little bit expensive, but then you can socket in 3 of the mana soul cores. So you're going to get a massive amount of mana. It is going to be more defensive than what we're doing here. It's also going to be less damage, but you're going to get to a point where damage is not an issue. So it's worth checking that out. As to explain what you'd want to get on a focus, which is what I'm doing. The focus is very defensive as well as defensively oriented. As you can see, you can roll +2 to level of all spell skill gems. So that's benefiting our spark, but it's also benefiting literally every other spell. And as you saw with the lightning mastery, every plus level to spark does a lot of damage. So for offense, you're going to want to go for +2 levels of all spell skill gems, cast speed, and preferably mana in the prefix. Although if you can't get mana, a close second would be lightning damage or spell damage instead. And aside from that, you could just go for a lot of energy shield because that's going to scale directly our mana and then in turn our energy shield. All right, so those are 2 really good options for the offhand slot, depending on what you want to do. I may end up using the defensive unique shield at some point, but it is pretty expensive, so I'm sticking with a well-rolled rare for now. Moving on to rings, which are the last piece of gear I'd label as truly damage-oriented, although we will touch on jewels later when we go over the passive tree. And you could say every single piece of gear in an Archmage build is offensive because we scale mana on the other pieces of gear, and mana gives us a lot of damage. But just to touch on rings, I currently don't have the best rings, so I just want to go over the ideal stats rather than showing off my rings. Because when you start off, you use your rings to res cap as a bare minimum, and I don't really need them to res cap, but I still just have my old res cap rings anyways. So assuming you don't need them for that purpose, you should be aiming to get cast speed in the suffix. You can get 24% increased cast speed. That is a ton of damage. And with all this damage, you probably won't be able to sustain the mana, which is why you want to get the other suffix, increased mana regeneration rate, which can roll up to 69%. So both of those coupled together are an insane DPS package. As for the rest of the suffixes, intelligence is obviously the strongest, but if you do need resistances, you should go resist instead. For prefixes, there aren't too many great ones. Obviously, you're going to want to have a high roll for mana. And all of these flat damage to attacks do not work for Spark. Spark is a spell. These rolls are dead. You could get a little bit of increased lightning damage, which is fine. You could get some increased rarity. But I would say for the prefixes, you don't really care what you get as long as you have mana, because mana is so much more important than anything else. So suffixes, very strong, mana, very strong, and maybe you can get a little bit of extra stuff with the other prefixes, but I would not call them mandatory. Now, you could go for 2 of these rings. If you're super rich, you could opt for Dream Fragments. Dream Fragments is a unique ring that gives us a bunch of mana. So getting percent mana is going to scale up the mana pool very nicely. It does give us mana regen and immunity to freeze and chill. I would not say this is mandatory, but if you have the money to throw around, it is an option here. All right, moving on to the rest of the gear. So we have 3 uniques: Katako's Current, Everlasting Gaze, and the Ingenuity Belt. The gloves and the amulet are mandatory. The gloves are what give us perma electrocute as a defensive layer. The amulet, as we've explained in past videos, is how we get any energy shield at all. All the energy shield is from this. The Ingenuity Belt is simply a best in slot unique belt that you can farm using Ritual. And if you want to self-farm this, I do have a guide on my channel going over how to farm the Ritual lead mechanic. This belt is best in slot because it can roll up to 80% increased bonuses from our equipped rings. So that means the belt is basically 1.6 times of our rings. And the rings are obviously quite powerful. The belt slot is quite weak, so it just ends up being a nice thing to have. As for the final 3 pieces of our gear, body armor, helmet, and boots. For the body armor, you can get an implicit if you get specific bases. So for example, something called Expert Keth Raiment will always come with between 40 and 50% increased mana regeneration rate as a bonus stat, no matter what. So you can try and get one of these if you can. They might be a little expensive. For the stats you want, you obviously want to have as high of an energy shield roll as possible because that's what's scaling our mana through Eldritch Battery. You could opt for Spirit in the prefixes. I don't have that. I actually have triple energy shield rolls. And as for suffixes, Intelligence is the best because it translates into 2 mana per intelligence, which scales defense as well as damage. The rest of the suffixes, I would try and get as much resistances as you can so you can get less of them on your rings. So that's body armor. Helmet, same thing as body armor. You're scaling energy shield, just not quite as much as the body armor. It's still the second best way to scale your energy shield. For the boots, you want to prioritize having 30% movement speed if possible. For prefixes, you want either percent increased energy shield or flat, as well as a very high mana roll. And then, as we said, suffixes, mixture of resistance as well as intelligence. As for skill gems, we've been testing out all the different options over the past couple of weeks, and we finally settled in some choices that I would say make a lot of sense. So for our Spark 6 link, we use Arcane Tempo, Acceleration, Inspiration, Considered Casting, and Unleash. The reason why we're using Unleash is it's just a very nice playstyle where when you build up charges and when you press Spark, it's going to unload all the charges at once. So it's like a triple hit of front-loaded damage. It also has, I'm not sure if it's a bug, but it shoots the sparks in a straight line, which is quite nice. They go forwards and then they eventually scatter everywhere. There's an added bonus with our particular setup, the Katako's current. So these gloves, they used to basically guarantee electrocute on first hit, but GGG did put out a patch slightly nerfing electrocute. However, the Unleash helped us bypass any potential nerf because you are doing triple hits right at once. So even if now it might require 2 hits to electrocute something that before the patch notes would be electrocuted instantly, you are still hitting 3 times at the same time. So they're still going to get that massive front-loaded damage that will allow us to insta-disable. Okay, we're also using Elemental Storm, which is an Ascendancy passive. And we're using this to apply exposure. So lightning exposure coupled with strip away to give even more exposure effect. Conduction, this also helps generate that exposure. Controlled destruction scales our damage, and the downside of this does not apply. So again, this is also helping to scale the exposure. And the 6th link, I put on Overcharge. This it's not important, but if you do happen to shock with the LE Storm, you're going to get a slightly higher shock. So it's something you could throw in there that we're not using anywhere else. If you want a crash course on why we're scaling exposure and how this affects our damage, there's a video in the playlist specifically going over minus res and what we're setting up here. All right, so I've added back in Orbis Storms. I really like this as a damage utility link. So we're using LE Focus for a lot of extra damage. Magnified effect, greater AoE. So the way you should use this is if you are setting up for a big engagement. So maybe you're going to be opening a ritual, maybe you're going to be opening a breach, maybe you're about to start a boss fight. You just throw this down, and every time you press Spark while you're near the Orbis Storms, this is just going to do a massive amount of damage. It is definitely worth the button. But this is not something we're using very often. It's just basically for when you're stopping and you're setting up for something really, like a really big engagement. We are using the Conductivity Curse supported by Heightened Curse, Focus Curse, and Hex Bloom. And I make use of a weapon swap to buff the power of this curse. And while we're on the topic of weapon swaps, we also have Sigil of Power. So you get that by getting a staff that grants Sigil of Power. That should be what you have on your weapon swap. And by nature, it will simply pull out the staff when you press Sigil of Power. And because of this, that means every other spell that you don't want on this weapon swap needs to be specifically binded to your wand and shield. So for me, that's weapon swap 2. So Spark only works weapon slot 2. Same with Orbis Storms. Now, Conductivity is an exception. We actually want this to only work with the staff, because the passive tree is going to be different for the staff and for the wand. So we're going to have all of our damage nodes on the wand, because whenever we press spark, the wand is getting pulled out. And we only ever have the staff out when we want to either press sigil power or curse an enemy. So just make sure everything else is locked on to weapon set 2. That's how you set that up. Now flame wall, I have this supported by energy barrier, spell cascade, and fortress. And I put that on my left mouse button. So generally the play style when I'm running through any sort of map is, tap flame wall, because flame wall adds a lot of damage to our sparks when they pass through it. And then I just shoot the spark, and that's sort of the clearing way we play this. And if there's something very difficult, we will pre-set up with Orb of Storms, with the flame wall, sigil of power, and then we'll start shooting. Okay. Mana Tempest, this is something we can use. I have it coupled with Premeditation. There's also Culling Strike you could put on there, but then it's going to drastically increase the cost of this, but that's an option. And you just stand in here and shoot, and you probably want to move out of it pretty quickly because it's going to start to drain your mana pretty quickly. And if you quality it, it will linger after you leave. So it's quite nice, just drop it, keep moving. So Blink, this is another tool using the weapon swap. It has to be only linked to the staff. And the way you do this is you have to weapon swap, and then instead of dodge rolling, you're going to blink. I don't like having to press weapon swap, because if you tap it twice, you're just going to dodge roll again. It's kind of clunky. I have an open gem slot, so I'm using Cold Snap to switch my weapon, because I can mash this button. Cold Snap has a very low cast time, so it's instant. I'm going to pull out the staff instantly, and I can just hit it a few times, and I'll still be able to blink. So if I'm panicking and I need to blink, just press Cold Snap and blink. The only reason I'm choosing this skill is because it casts so quickly. And then the last skill is Archmage, supported by Lightning Mastery. But actually, we do have to explain how to set up this Blink and Archmage, because these are both spirit reservations. So actually, Archmage, this is only turned on when I have my wand out, because I only really need this damage when I'm casting Spark. And that means Blink will be able to have some reservation when I pull out the staff. Blink actually only takes up 70 with this setup, so I do have some free spirit. That doesn't really matter. We're only ever with the staff out for very short periods of time when we want to cast a specific buff. Then we're switching back to the wand. The support gems for Blink are Clarity and Ingenuity. The support gem for Archmage is Lightning Mastery, which you don't actually need unless you're hitting a breakpoint. Right now I'm level 20. I do believe level 21 might be another damage breakpoint, so we're leaving this in here because I don't need it anywhere else right now. Now let's wrap up this video with the character's passive tree. And if you're leveling from scratch, you should be leveling with a life-based tree, and you can find that in the Stormweaver playlist in the video description. You can also find in the video description a Mobalytics link which covers this whole passive tree as well as the gem setups, if that's slightly easier for you to follow. Now I don't want to just read through all these passives, so we'll just go over the fundamentals here. We're scaling a lot of increased energy shield because, again, we are energy shield based, as well as a lot of mana regen, simply because we need a lot of that to sustain our spells. Now the big thing here is the curse setup. So weapon swap 1 is all the curse points. So when we have weapon swap 1 on, this is all spec'd. These travel nodes are all spec'd into these curse nodes, as well as this. And I'd say this is all pretty important. You do want to spend all 24 points here. And when we swap back to weapon set 2, which we'll be using 99% of the time, now we have these mana regen nodes, all of the damage, all of this damage. And I did have to take off one little bit of defense to fit in the curse setup. If you don't have enough levels, I would say you cut everything in this quadrant. Just take that off. Not mandatory. And one thing to note in terms of stun threshold, you need this if your character is getting stunned. And that you'll notice because your character is sort of flinching when he gets hit or when she gets hit. So if you're noticing that happening, you're getting staggered, it affects your ability to cast. You need to invest more of this. I have enough where it feels comfortable for my character, but you could just type in stun threshold. There's a lot very close by. You could get more over here. You could grab this entire wheel. There's some options for you if you feel like you need more. Okay, so I don't want to touch into all the nitty-gritty of how everything interacts with each other. The previous video I said is mandatory viewing already explains how Eldritch Battery, Mind Over Matter works in conjunction with Everlasting Gaze. So that video will also explain more in depth of why we're taking what on the passive tree. Here, I think you can just copy it at this point. I don't need to keep repeating myself. As for jewels, I think getting 20% chance to pierce is pretty powerful because you can think of that as like 20% more damage, kind of, because by nature, our spark, when they hit an enemy, they just disappear. If you have 100% pierce, they can go through the first enemy and then they'll disappear after hitting the second. So that's essentially potentially doubling your damage. Obviously, it's not guaranteed, but you have the option, you have the possibility of that happening. So I do like to get pierce if possible. I'm anointing 50% chance to pierce on the amulet with piercing shot, and that takes the disgust, guilt, disgust, emotions. I'll probably have a video where I deep dive all the different jewel mods and how I value them against each other. So you can see like lightning damage, elemental damage are both good. Magnitude of shock is fine, that's pretty good. LA damage again here. For this one, we have a lot of increased damage against rares and uniques, and that's probably what you need to have the damage for the most. Some projectile speed. Then I do have a jewel with Corrupted Blood immunity. Now, I don't feel like Corrupted Blood is that big of a deal in PoE 2. In PoE 1, this used to be a really annoying debuff that would degen you quite frequently. But anyways, I invested in that regardless. And this one has faster start of energy shield recharge. I do really like that node. Unfortunately, you have to choose Pierce or energy shield recharge because this one is only on the sapphire gems and Pierce is only on the emerald jewels. Now, I guess we could touch on what I'm doing here. It's a From Nothing jewel that goes to Heartstopper. This is definitely not mandatory. If this is at all expensive, I don't suggest you do it. It is just letting me take electrotherapy, which gives me increased electrocute buildup. You don't need this since we're doing Unleash, but again, more power on the electrocute is obviously nice. This node is currently bugged. It should reduce my mana cost by 15%, and it's not currently doing that. But I do have it allocated in the hopes that the developers fix this, because reducing the mana cost by 15% would be nice in an ideal situation. As for the Ascendancy nodes, Arcane Surge, Force of Will, Tempest Caller is how we're applying the exposure, and then we're doubling the exposure with Scouring Winds. I think this is good enough where we don't actually have to scale it up with the node beyond it. I like this setup. Alright, that's a wrap for this build guide, but this is not the end to my Spark content. You can expect coming out tomorrow probably a video on how to level with some Twink gear if you want to play Spark as a second character. I also want to make a video deep diving the different modifiers we can get on rare jewels to sort of rank them. Obviously, we're going to have aspirational content once I scale this into truly God tier territory, and we'll put out a build guide for that at some point or other. All right, hope you enjoyed the video. We'll be live on Twitch for the rest of the day. Peace.